You paid for me, I'm taking it off now. The giant bride did. And then she had a husband. In 1887, Wyoming, strength in a woman was considered a curse. Sarah Brennan had been rejected 12 times. Too tall, too strong, too much. So she bound herself, made herself smaller, tried to disappear. But when a lonely rancher named Jim Thornton paid for her passage west, something unexpected happened. The day she finally stood at her full height, removed every restraint, and said, "This is what you bought." He looked up at her with tears in his eyes and whispered 3 words that would break her. "There you are." This is what happened when 2 people stopped hiding. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, dust swirling like ghosts in the late afternoon light. Sarah Brennan couldn't breathe. Not because of the long journey from Pennsylvania. Not because of the August heat pressing down on the Wyoming prairie like a heavy blanket. But because of the cloth wrapped so tight around her ribs that every breath felt like punishment. She'd been binding herself for 3 days straight now, pulling the fabric tighter each morning, making herself smaller, more acceptable, less of what she really was. Her shoulders ached from hunching forward. Her back screamed from bending. But pain was better than rejection. Pain she could handle. It was the look in men's eyes she couldn't bear anymore. That flash of disappointment. That step backward. That nervous laugh that said, "No thank you, not you, never you." The door opened. Sarah forced herself to step down, keeping her head low, arms crossed tight over her chest. She'd learned to make herself invisible. Learned to take up less space in a world that had no room for women like her. The platform beneath her feet felt unsteady, or maybe that was just her knees threatening to give out. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading for 600 miles. The moment when Jim Thornton, the man who'd paid good money for a mail-order bride, would see what he'd actually gotten. And then he'd send her back. Just like all the others, she heard boots on wood. Slow, deliberate steps. She kept her eyes on the ground, on the dust coating her worn traveling shoes, on anything but the man approaching. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack a rib. "Please," she prayed silently, "please let him be kind when he tells me no. Please don't let him laugh. Miss Brennan." The voice was deep, weathered, gentle, like wind moving through canyon walls. Sarah's breath caught. Slowly, so slowly, she lifted her eyes. And there he was, Jim Thornton, 50-something years carved into sun-darkened skin, silver beard, deep lines around eyes that had seen too much loneliness, a battered cowboy hat in his hands, fingers turning it over and over like he didn't know what else to do with them. He wasn't tall, maybe 5'8", average build, wearing a vest over a faded work shirt, dust on his boots, calluses on his palms. But his eyes, God, his eyes. They weren't looking at her body. They were looking at her face. Really looking, like he was trying to find something he'd lost a long time ago. "Mr. Thornton," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. She braced herself, waited for it, the disappointment, the regret, the polite but firm, "I think there's been a mistake." Instead, he smiled, small, almost shy, but real. "Welcome home, Sarah," 2 words. That's all it took. Welcome home. Sarah's vision blurred. No one had ever called her that. Home, like she was something precious, like she was wanted. She bit the inside of her cheek hard, tasting copper, forcing back the tears that would make her look weak, pathetic, desperate. I have your letters," Jim said, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a bundle tied with string, edges worn from being read and reread. "I hope you don't mind. I've been carrying them with me. They've been good company these past few months." Sarah stared at the letters. Her letters. The words she'd poured out late at night by candlelight, telling this stranger things she'd never told anyone. About the sunsets from her tenement window, about the old woman who fed stray cats, about loneliness, feeling like forgetting what your own voice sounded like. She'd written those things thinking no one would really care, that he'd skim them and forget, that the words didn't matter as much as the photograph. The photograph. Her stomach dropped. That picture had been taken at an angle, with her sitting down, shoulders curved forward, everything about it designed to make her look smaller, softer, normal. He'd seen that picture. He thought that's what was coming. "And now, I should tell you something," Jim said, tucking the letters back into his pocket. When your first letter came, there was a photograph with it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I didn't look at it. I put it in a drawer and I never took it out. Sarah's heart stopped. You, what? I didn't need to see it, he said simply. Your words told me everything I needed to know. The way you described the first snow falling, how you noticed small kindnesses most people miss, the hope in your voice even after everything you'd been through. His voice cracked slightly. I knew the woman who wrote those letters was the woman I wanted to know. The rest didn't matter. The world tilted. Sarah grabbed the stagecoach door to steady herself. He didn't know. He had no idea what he'd actually paid for, what was standing in front of him right now, bound and compressed and hidden. When he found out, let me get your trunk, Jim said, moving past her toward the luggage. The ranch is about an hour's ride. I thought we could stop by the creek if you're hungry. I brought some bread and, Mr. Thornton, her voice came out sharper than she meant. He turned, concern crossing his face. Sarah's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her sides. There's something you need to know. Before we go any further, her throat closed up. Jim set down the trunk, walked back over, stood a respectful distance away, hat still in his hands. Sarah, he said gently, whatever you need to tell me, it's all right. Take your time. Take your time. Like she had time. Like dragging this out would make it hurt less when he realized his mistake. No, better to rip it off fast. Better to get it over with now, here, before she started hoping. Before she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be different. I'm not what you think, she said, forcing the words out. The photograph, it was, I'm not like that. I'm not, she couldn't find the words. How do you explain that you're too much? That you've spent your whole life being too tall, too strong, too wrong for the world you were born into? Jim's expression didn't change. He just waited, patient, kind. That kindness made it worse somehow. Made what was coming hurt more. I'm different, Sarah finally said. I'm too... Her voice broke. She hated how weak she sounded. Hated the tears burning behind her eyes. Everyone else saw it right away. Everyone else knew immediately that I wasn't... That I couldn't... Sarah. Jim's voice was soft but firm. He took one step closer, just one. Look at me, she did. Those eyes again, steady, clear, no judgment in them. Not yet. I don't know what those other people saw, Jim said quietly. And I don't care. I know what I see. I see a woman who's been traveling for days to get here, who's tired and scared and probably wondering if she made a terrible mistake. I see someone who's been hurt before and is trying real hard not to get hurt again. He paused. I see someone brave, brave. The word hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't brave. Brave people didn't hide. Brave people didn't bind themselves into something acceptable. You don't understand, she started. Then help me understand, he said. But not here. Not standing in the dust after a long journey. Come to the ranch, rest, eat something. And then, when you're ready, you can tell me whatever you need to tell me. And Sarah, he met her eyes. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Together. Another word she didn't know what to do with. Sarah had been alone for so long, she'd forgotten what together felt like. Part of her wanted to get back on that stagecoach right now. Run before the inevitable happened. Before she started to hope and got crushed again. But another part, a small, stubborn part she thought had died years ago, whispered, what if? What if this time is different? What if he means it? All right, she heard herself say. All right, Jim's face broke into a real smile then. The kind that reached his eyes and made the years fall away. Good, he said. That's real good. He grabbed her trunk like it weighed nothing and headed toward a horse and wagon waiting nearby. Fair warning, he called over his shoulder. I'm not much of a cook, but I make decent coffee, and the wildflowers are real pretty this time of year. Wildflowers, he remembered. From her letters, the ones he'd read 20 times and carried in his pocket. Sarah followed him on shaking legs, each step feeling like walking off a cliff. The binding around her ribs felt impossibly tight now. She couldn't keep this up much longer. Maybe tonight, maybe after dinner, she'd find the words somehow. She'd tell him the truth, and then she'd watch that kindness in his eyes turn to disappointment like it always did. But for now, For just this moment, riding across the golden prairie with the sun painting everything warm and possible, Sarah let herself pretend, let herself imagine what it might feel like to be someone's home. The ranch appeared on the horizon, just as the sun started sinking low. A simple cabin, weathered barn, fences that needed mending, grass stretching forever in every direction, isolated, lonely, beautiful. Jim pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, offering his hand to help her. Sarah hesitated, then took it. His palm was rough with work, warm, steady. For just a second, his fingers squeezed hers gently. A promise or a question, she couldn't tell which. "Well," he said, looking up at the cabin with something like nervousness. "It's not much, but it's home. Home." There was that word again. Sarah stared at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the lamp already lit in the window, like someone had been waiting for her. And something in her chest cracked. Not broke, just cracked enough to let a tiny sliver of light in. "It's perfect," she whispered, and the really terrifying thing was, she almost meant it. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and something else Sarah couldn't quite name. Safety, maybe. Or the ghost of it. Jim lit another lamp, golden light spreading across simple furniture, a stone fireplace, rough-hewn floors that had been swept clean. On the small wooden table by the window sat a mason jar filled with wildflowers. Yellow prairie blooms, their petals still fresh. Sarah stopped in the doorway, staring at those flowers. "I remembered," Jim said quietly, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "You wrote about loving wildflowers, how your ma used to pick them when you were small. I thought you might like to see some when you arrived." Her mother. Sarah hadn't mentioned her mother in years, had tried not to think about those days, before everything changed, before her father's death, before she grew too tall and too strong and became something the world didn't want. But she'd written about it to Jim. Late one night, when the loneliness felt like drowning, she'd written about her mother's hands covered in pollen, about the kitchen table always holding flowers, about feeling loved once upon a time, and he'd remembered. "Your room's through there," Jim said, pointing to a door on the left. "I hope it's all right. I cleaned it up best I could. Changed the linens. There's a basin for washing and—" He stopped, running a hand through his silver hair. "I'm nervous," he admitted with a small laugh. "Talking too much. You must be exhausted." Sarah wanted to speak but couldn't. The binding around her ribs had shifted during the ride, cutting into her skin in new places. Every breath felt like knives. But more than the physical pain was the growing weight of what she had to tell him. Soon. It had to be soon. Before he got more attached to the idea of who he thought she was. "I'll make us some supper," Jim said, moving toward the small kitchen area. "Nothing fancy. Just beans and cornbread. But there's butter, and I've got some dried apples if you're Mr. Thornton." Her voice came out strained. "Jim, I can't." She pressed a hand to her ribs, wincing. He was beside her in an instant. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "Nothing. It's nothing, She took a shallow breath, the room tilting slightly. When had she last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Fear had a way of killing appetite. "Sit down," Jim said firmly, guiding her to a chair. "When's the last time you had food, water?" He was already moving, pouring water from a pitcher, pressing the cup into her hands. "Drink." Slowly, Sarah drank. The water was cool, clean, tasted like it came from a deep well. It helped, a little. But her ribs still screamed, and her lungs still couldn't fully expand, and Jim was kneeling in front of her now, concern etched deep in his weathered face, and she couldn't keep lying. Not to someone looking at her like she mattered. "I'm hurting," she said quietly. "But it's my own fault. How's it your fault?" His voice was gentle but confused. Sarah set down the cup with shaking hands. This was it. The moment everything would change. The moment that kindness in his eyes would fade, and she'd be alone again, just like always. But she was so tired of hiding, so tired of trying to be smaller, so tired of the pain. "Because I'm not what you think I am," she said. "The photograph you didn't look at, it was taken to make me look normal. But I'm not normal, Jim. Her voice cracked. "I'm too much. Too tall, too strong. Do everything that women aren't supposed to be. She waited for him to lean back, to stand up, to put distance between them. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, kneeling in front of her chair, looking up into her face. "And that's why you're hurting?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded, tears spilling over now, hot and shameful. "I've been binding myself for years, trying to make myself smaller, more acceptable. I thought if I could just compress enough, bend enough, disappear enough, then maybe someone would." She couldn't finish. The words hurt worse than the binding. Jim was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "May I ask you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "The woman who wrote to me about watching sunsets," he said slowly, "about noticing small kindnesses, about believing that love should feel like coming home, not like apologizing for existing. Was she real?" "What?" Sarah blinked through her tears. "Those letters," Jim continued, "those words. That heart I fell in love with before I ever saw your face. Was that real? Or was that something you made smaller too?" The question hit her like a fist to the chest. That was real. That was the only real thing I had left. Then that's all I need to know." Jim stood slowly, his knees creaking. He walked to the window, stared out at the darkening prairie. "Sarah, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. Can you do that?" She nodded again, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "I was married before," Jim said quietly. 23 years, to a woman named Elizabeth. She was small, delicate, everything a woman was supposed to be back then. And I loved her. God knows I loved her. But she died 3 years ago. Fever took her in 4 days. I buried her out there under the cottonwood tree. Sarah's heart clenched. He'd never mentioned this in his letters. "After she died, I thought I was done," Jim continued. "Thought I'd just work this ranch until my body gave out, and that would be that. But then winter came, and spring, and another winter, and I realized something. I wasn't living. I was just existing, going through motions. And the loneliness, Sarah, the loneliness was killing me slower than any fever could." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight, she could see the shine of tears in his eyes. "So I did something crazy," he said. "I put an advertisement in a Boston paper, and I got 7 responses. 7 women willing to come west to marry a stranger. But only one of those letters made me feel something again. Only one made me remember what it was like to hope." He walked back over, knelt down again so they were eye level. "That was your letter, Sarah. Your words. Your heart. And I don't care if you're 6 feet tall or 7 feet tall. I don't care if you can lift a horse or rope a steer better than I can. What I care about is that the woman who wrote those words is real. That she's here. That maybe, if I'm real lucky, she might give me a chance to know her. All of her. Not the compressed version. Not the version that fits into someone else's idea of acceptable. But the real version." Sarah couldn't breathe. Not because of the binding now, but because of the enormity of what he was saying. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "Then show me," Jim said simply. "Sarah, you said you're taking it off. The binding. All of it. So do it. Right now. Show me what you've been so afraid of." "Jim, I'm not afraid," he said firmly. "I've been alone too long to be afraid of something as beautiful as the truth." Beautiful. He'd called it beautiful. Sarah looked at this man kneeling in front of her, this weathered rancher who'd chosen her words over her photograph, who'd put wildflowers on the table, who was looking at her like she was something precious instead of something wrong. And she made a decision, maybe the bravest decision of her entire life. "All right," she said, standing up on trembling legs. "All right. But Jim, when you see, if you change your mind, I'll understand. I'll go quietly. I won't make a fuss. Sarah," he stood too, gave her space. "I won't change my mind. You don't know that." "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." Sarah's hands moved to the buttons of her traveling dress. They shook so badly she could barely work them free. 1, 2, 3. The fabric loosened. Beneath it was the binding. Layers and layers of cloth wrapped around her torso, compressing her ribs, her shoulders, her very breath. She'd done it herself this morning, in a Denver hotel room, pulling tighter and tighter, until tears streamed down her face, and her reflection in the mirror looked almost acceptable. She began unwinding it, The cloth fell away in long strips, piling on the floor like shed skin. With each layer removed, her breathing came easier. Her shoulders straightened, her spine lengthened. She could feel herself expanding, taking up more space, becoming what she really was. Finally, the last strip fell away. Sarah stood there in her simple undergarments and dress, no longer compressed, no longer bent. She straightened to her full height. 6'3" of her, broad shoulders, strong arms, muscles from years of factory work that no amount of binding could fully hide. She stood there trembling, waiting for the look, the disappointment. The step back Jim was staring. She could feel his eyes on her. This was it. This was where he'd realize his mistake, where he'd... There you are. His voice was thick with emotion. Sarah's eyes snapped to his face. He wasn't looking at her with disappointment. He was looking at her with wonder, with something that looked almost like reverence. There you are, he said again, and his voice broke on the last word. The woman from the letters. I've been waiting to meet her. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Jim, I'm too much. No. He stepped closer, had to look up to meet her eyes. You're not too much. You've never been too much. Everyone else was wrong. His hands came up slowly, carefully, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he cupped her face gently, his calloused thumbs wiping away her tears. Sarah Brennan, you're the exact measure of everything I've been looking for. Something broke inside her then. Not broke bad, but broke open, like ice cracking after a long winter. A sob tore from her throat, and she collapsed to her knees, her whole body shaking with years of held-back grief. And Jim went down with her, pulling her into his arms, holding her while she cried, like she hadn't let herself cry in a decade. I've got you, he murmured into her hair. I've got you, Sarah. You're home now. You're safe. I've got you. She cried for the 12 rejections, for the years of binding herself into pain, for her mother's death and her father's death, and every cruel word ever thrown at her by strangers who didn't know her name. She cried for the loneliness and the fear and the deep, aching belief that she would never be loved as she was, and Jim held her through all of it, steady, solid, real. When her sobs finally quieted to hiccups, when she could breathe again without gasping, she pulled back enough to look at him. His shirt was soaked with her tears. His eyes were red, but he was smiling. Actually smiling. I'm sorry, she managed. I got your shirt all... Sarah, I don't care about my shirt. He laughed, the sound rough but genuine. You just showed me the bravest thing I've ever seen. You think I care about a wet shirt? She laughed too, waterlogged and broken, but real. When was the last time she'd laughed? Really laughed? Come on, Jim said gently, standing and offering his hand. Let's get you some food. You're probably starving, and I'm betting those ribs of yours could use a break from all that binding. Sarah took his hand, let him pull her up, stood at her full height beside him, and for the first time in her life didn't hunch, didn't bend, didn't try to disappear. Jim looked up at her, and the expression on his face was so tender it made her want to cry all over again. Look at you, he said softly, standing tall. Just like you were meant to. I tower over you, she pointed out, almost apologetic. I noticed. He grinned. I'm going to need a stool to kiss you properly. Sarah's breath caught. You want to kiss me? Sarah, I want to kiss you every morning for the rest of my life. If you'll let me. The rest of his life. He was talking about forever. About actually marrying her, not just out of obligation, but because he wanted to. Because he chose her. I don't understand, she whispered. Why me? You could have chosen any of those other women. Smaller women, normal women. Jim stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gray in his beard, the lines around his eyes, the absolute certainty in his gaze. Because when I read your letters, Sarah, I didn't see words on a page. I heard a voice I'd been listening for my whole life. And I knew in my bones that you were my other half. My missing piece, he paused. And maybe I'm your missing piece too. Not because we're the same, but because we fit anyway. Despite everything that made them different, despite all the ways the world said they shouldn't work, they fit anyway. I'd like that, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd like to try. Good. Jim squeezed her hand. That's real good. Now come on. Let's get some food in you and then you can rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to start figuring out forever. Forever. With this man, in this place, as herself, fully herself. For the first time in her life, forever didn't sound like a prison sentence. It sounded like hope. The next 2 weeks passed, like a dream Sarah kept waiting to wake up from. She worked beside Jim every day, hauling water, mending fences, feeding horses. And for the first time in her life, her strength wasn't something to hide. It was useful, needed. When a fence post needed lifting, Jim didn't try to do it alone out of pride. He just stepped back and let her help. When she carried 2 full water buckets without breaking a sweat, he didn't look embarrassed. He looked grateful. You're a natural at this, he said one afternoon, watching her repair a section of fence he'd been putting off for months. Better than me, honestly. Sarah paused, hammer in hand, waiting for the resentment that always came when men realized she could do things they couldn't. But Jim just smiled, genuine, proud, almost. Like her capability made him happy instead of threatened. At night, they sat by the fire. Jim read poetry aloud, while Sarah mended clothes or peeled potatoes. Sometimes their hands would brush, reaching for the same thing, and electricity would spark between them. Jim never pushed, never demanded, just waited, patient as the prairie itself, for her to feel safe enough to let him closer. On the 14th night, during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin walls, Sarah finally broke. Lightning cracked and she flinched. Memories flooding back of the night her parents' barn caught fire, of screaming and smoke and loss. Before she could stop herself, she was crying, shaking, gasping for air. Jim was beside her in seconds. Hey, it's all right. You're safe. I'm right here. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm being ridiculous. It's just a storm. You're not ridiculous. He guided her to his reading chair, sat down, and gently pulled her to sit on the floor beside him, her back against his legs. My Elizabeth used to get scared during storms, too. Said they reminded her of bad things. There's no shame in it. He began reading Robert Burns, his voice steady and low, one hand resting gently in her hair. The storm raged outside, but Sarah felt anchored, safe, like nothing could touch her here. When the poem ended, she turned to look up at him. Jim, yeah, thank you for seeing me, for not running. His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheek. Sarah, I've been alone in the dark a long time. You're not something to run from. You're the light I've been looking for. She leaned up. He leaned down. Their lips met halfway, gentle at first, then deeper. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. Marry me, Jim whispered. Not because of some arrangement, not because you feel you owe me. Marry me because I love you. Every impossible, beautiful inch of you. Yes, Sarah breathed. Yes, Jim, 1,000 times yes. Outside, the storm began to fade. Inside, 2 broken people became whole. The town gathered under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Sarah stood in the small church, wearing a dress Jim's neighbor had made special. No binding, no compression, just simple white cotton that let her breathe. Let her stand tall, the women whispered. She heard the words, giant, unnatural, poor man. But then Jim stepped forward, and the whispers died. He looked up at her with tears streaming down his weathered face, took both her hands in his, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Before I say my vows, I need to tell you all something. His voice was steady, clear. This woman right here is the bravest person I've ever known. She walked through a world that told her she was wrong, told her she was too much, told her she didn't belong. And she kept her heart soft anyway. She kept believing in love. She kept hoping. His voice cracked, but he pushed on. I'm the lucky one. I'm the one who gets to love her. And I'll spend every day of my life making sure she knows she was worth waiting for. She was worth everything. Sarah's tears fell hot and fast. The congregation sat silent, moved despite themselves. Even the women who'd whispered looked away, ashamed. The preacher cleared his throat. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Jim reached up. Sarah bent down. They met in the middle, and when their lips touched, the church erupted in applause. Not polite applause. Real, thunderous, joyful noise. Outside, Jim helped Sarah onto the wagon. Before climbing up beside her, he turned to the gathered crowd. There'll be a celebration at the ranch next month. You're all invited. Bring food, bring music. We've got a lot of living to catch up on. The ride home was quiet, peaceful. Sarah's hand rested in Jim's lap. His thumb traced circles on her palm. When the ranch came into view, golden in the late afternoon light, Sarah felt something she'd never felt before. Like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That night, they danced in the barn by lamplight. No music except Jim's humming. No audience except the horses. Sarah towered over him, her head nearly touching the rafters, and she didn't care. He looked up at her like she hung the moon. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" He asked. "What?" She whispered. "Home. I see home, Sarah. I see every prayer I've whispered. I see the other half of my soul." She kissed him then, deep and long and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Jim was grinning. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking. I'm going to need to build higher door frames. Maybe raise the roof a bit." Sarah laughed, the sound echoing off the barn walls. "You do that, really?" "Sarah, I'd build you a palace if you wanted. But something tells me all you really want is this, us, home. That's all I've ever wanted," she said. "Someone to see me. Really see me." "Then you've got it," Jim said. "For as long as I'm breathing, you've got it." Spring came. Sarah planted wildflowers around the house, their colors bright against the prairie grass. She worked the ranch alongside Jim, her strength no longer hidden, but celebrated. Neighboring ranchers started asking for her help with heavy work. The women who'd whispered began bringing her bread, asking for advice, seeing her differently now. One morning, Jim found Sarah in the garden, surrounded by blooms, her face turned toward the sun. He came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, pressed his cheek against her back. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I knew was possible," she answered. "Me too." He squeezed tighter. "Me too." They stood there in the morning light. Two people who'd been told they were too much and not enough, who'd found each other across miles of loneliness. They stood there, fitting together in all the ways that mattered, proof that love doesn't ask you to be smaller. It asks you to be brave enough to be exactly who you are. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, it asks you to be home. Sarah turned in his arms, looked down at this man who'd chosen her words before her face, who'd called her beautiful when she stopped hiding, who'd loved her not despite her size, but as part of the whole magnificent truth of who she was. "I love you, Jim Thornton," she said. "I love you, Sarah Thornton," he answered. And in the quiet of that Wyoming morning, with wildflowers nodding in the breeze and the prairie stretching forever, two broken pieces finally became whole. Love isn't about fitting into someone else's world. It's about building a world together where both of you finally fit. Where too much becomes just right. Where the things that made you different become the very things that make you perfect for each other. This is what happened when two people stopped hiding. When they chose truth over comfort. When they discovered that home isn't a place, it's a person who sees you, all of you, and says, "There you are. I've been waiting for you." If this story touched something deep inside you, if it reminded you that your worth isn't measured by how small you can make yourself, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on the notification bell, because we've got more stories like this coming. More tales from the western frontier, where broken people found healing, where outcasts found family, where love showed up in the most unexpected places and changed everything. More stories about courage, redemption, and the kind of romance that restores your faith in humanity. Don't miss a single one. Subscribe now, and let's keep riding this trail together. There are more stories waiting, and every single one of them is worth telling. The end.